morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Michaela Romesser, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time and talk about the E-2 visa. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. So some of you may know that the firm Scott Legal PC was found on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including F1, TN, B, and H1B. And as such, we know what you are going through. The firm is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in a number of different areas, including E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waiver, EB-5, and extraordinary ability visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, and this means where the investment amount is on the lower side. We have processed E-2 visas at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We'll continue to have this webinar series, and we'll have at least 2 webinars a week on different immigration topics. At the end of this webinar, we'll send you out a few things. So we'll be sending you the PowerPoint we'll be using today. We'll also send you a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail. We'll also send you a link where you can set up a consultation with one of our attorneys. And we'll also send you a link to our YouTube channel where we often post immigration videos on different immigration topics. So as for today, we are lucky to have our partner, Kelly LeGrand Weiner, who has a vast experience with E-2 visas. And my name is Michaela Romesser, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. So finally, for any questions you have, please add the question to the Q&A box or to the chat box, and we will get to all questions at the end of the webinar. Perfect. So why don't we get started? An E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of certain countries to come to the US to develop and direct operations of an enterprise in which they have invested money. So there must be, to qualify for an E-2 visa, there must be a treaty between the US and the foreign country. So many countries around the world are E-2 visa treaty countries. Some examples would be, for example, Canada, Mexico, Argentina, UK, France, Italy, Poland, Japan, and many, many more. Regarding how long your E-2 visa is valid for, this is going to depend on your country of nationality, because nationals of different countries can get the E-2 visa for a different period of time. So there are many, many countries which nationals can get the E-2 visa for up to 5 years. There are some countries where the nationals can get it, for example, for 4 years. And there are some countries where the nationals of those countries can get the E-2 visa for a shorter period of time. So, for example, nationals of Jordan can get the E-2 visa stamp only for a period of 3 months. For example, nationals of Poland can only get it for 1 year. So it kind of really depends on your country of nationality. And the period for which you can get the E-2 visa approved for is called the reciprocity period. Regardless of the reciprocity period, every time someone enters the US on a valid E-2 visa, either an E-2 investor or an E-2 employee or spouses and children, dependents, they will be allowed to stay for up to 2 years. So this is going to be a case, for example, if you are a national of Poland, you can only get the E-2 visa approved for 1 year. Every time throughout the 1 year period, every time you come to the US, you will be allowed to stay for a period of 2 years. That is the case also if you are a national, for example, Canada, your E-2 visa stamp is valid for 5 years. You would not be able to kind of stay in the US the entire 5 years. You would be admitted for a period of 2 years. And before the 2-year period is up, you would have to leave the US and then re-enter to get a new 2-year period. Perfect. So now let's move on. And let's talk a little bit about 2 options how you can obtain the E-2 visa. So the first option how you can obtain the E-2 visa is to start a business in the US. So in this case, you would be starting your own company from scratch. So you would have to set up an entity in the US. You would have to get the employer identification number for the entity. You would have to set up a bank account for that entity, transfer the investment funds to the E-2 company's account, and then you would have to make an investment in the US through that E-2 entity. So this is a good option, you know, like if you know that you want to start a business in certain industry, you want to start your own business, this would be a great option for you. The other option, how to get an E-2 visa, is to purchase an already existing business in the US. Here, franchises would also kind of fall under this option. We do a lot of E-2 visas for people who are purchasing franchises, or it could really be kind of any business you would like to purchase. And in this case, you would still have to set up an entity in the US, and then you would purchase an already existing business in the US. There are a few things you should kind of look at, like if you are interested in purchasing a business in the US. And we could definitely kind of assist with, like in this process. So you would definitely want to kind of look at the tax returns of the business you are buying. So generally, because like those would be the documents you would be submitting as part of the E-2 visa application. So generally, the tax returns should show that the revenues of the company have been increasing throughout the years. And then one other important thing to look at is kind of at the W-2s, or kind of how many employees the business you are buying has. Because one of the requirements for the E-2 visa is that the E-2 company employs you as workers. So if you are buying a business and the business, is just kind of like run by one person that is the owner, like that may not be the best business to purchase for the E-2 visa. It still could be possibly an option, but the case would be definitely a riskier case. And in that case, you would want to submit a detailed business plan, kind of explaining, like how the business will hire you as workers in the future, because, if the business hasn't had employees in the past couple of years. One thing I wanted to mention about when you are purchasing a business in the US, so there are 2 ways how you can kind of transfer transfer the money to the business. So one way to sign a purchase sale agreement and just buy the business and transfer the money directly to the seller. One risk in this case is that if the government doesn't approve the E-2 visa, there is no way for you to, like, how to get out of the transaction. Like, even if the E-2 visa is not approved, if it is for any reason, you would still have to, you purchase the business in the US, and you would have to hire someone who would kind of like run the business or run it from your home country. The other way is to transfer the money through an escrow agent. So in this case, the one advantage of this transaction would be that you would transfer the money to the escrow agent. The escrow agent would hold the purchase price in an escrow. And if the E-2 visa is approved, the escrow agent would transfer the money to the seller of the business. And if for any reason it's not approved, the money would go back to you. One important thing is that in this case, you would have to submit a purchase sale agreement and also escrow agreement. And in the escrow agreement, the only kind of contingency to the sale of the business could be the approval of the E-2 business. So all the other contingencies would have to be met, and the only kind of like outstanding contingency is the approval of the E-2 business. Perfect. Now, let's discuss the E-2 visa requirements in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned already, the first requirement is that you must be a national of one of the E-2 visa treaty countries. One thing to keep in mind here is that what matters is the country of your nationality, and it doesn't matter where, what is the country of your birth. So it is completely fine if you were born in a country that is not one of the E-2 visa treaty countries. Later in your life, you obtain another nationality. And, now that country is one of the E-2 visa treaty countries. So that is completely fine. You would just apply for the E-2 visa with that second passport. So the second requirement is that you must make an investment in the US. So what does this mean? What does it mean to make an investment? How high does the investment have to be? So for the E-2, the money, the investment or the money you are investing, it must be at risk. For E-2, what would not be sufficient, what would not meet the requirement is that, let's say you transfer $100,000 from your home country to the E-2 company's bank account, and it's just kind of sitting on the bank account, and then you kind of explain in your application that you plan to spend the money in the future after the E-2 visa is granted. So unfortunately, this would not work for the E-2 visa. So for the E-2 visa, the consulate or USCIS, they want to see that the investment has already been made at the time you are applying for the E-2 visa. And so this means that the money is at risk and that you have something to lose if the E-2 visa is not approved. This would be the at-risk requirement. For the E-2 visa, we'll also have to explain kind of like what is the source of the funds you are investing. So the rule is that the money for the E-2 investment can come from any legitimate source, and it cannot come from criminal activity. And you will basically have to submit documents explaining what is the source of the funds in the application. So the sources can be different. I would say some common sources of funds would be, for example, if the money is coming from your savings, you saved over the years from your employment. In that case, you would submit your three or more tax returns, just showing that you were earning, salary and working either in your home country or in the US. Another source, for example, could be if you sold a property in your home country. In that case, you would want to submit a purchase sale agreement for the property and then bank statement, like showing that you receive the purchase price from the seller on your personal account. The investment funds could also come from a gift or loan. Both of those are fine. For the gift, you would want to submit a gift letter from the person who is gifting you the money. It can be anyone, it can be family, friends, anyone can gift you the funds. But you would also have to kind of submit documents explaining where the person who is gifting you the funds, like how did they get the money. So let's say that the money they are gifting you came from their personal earnings, like savings from employment, then you would have to submit their tax returns. So you would still have to kind of submit documents showing how they got the money they are gifting you for the E-2 investment. Loans are also fine for an E-2. It can be either an institutional loan or it can be a loan from, again, family, friends. One type of loan that would not work for the E-2 would be if the loan is secured by the assets of the E-2 business. But if the loan is secured by anything else, like your personal property or real estate property, or if the loan is unsecured, that would be fine. So the E-2 investment must be substantial, and we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So what are some typical E-2 expenditures? So in case you are starting an E-2 company, then the typical E-2 expenditures would be basically any expenditures you have to make to get the E-2 company up and running. So it would be, for example, money you paid for the business entity setup. It would be money you paid for any like marketing or website setup. If you will be selling products, it would be the money you pay to purchase the inventory. It could be like money you pay to buy computer or any other equipment you buy. It could be money like you pay to rent office or warehouse space. So it would be basically like any expenditures you make to get the business up and running. In case you are purchasing an already existing business, then the E-2 investment would be the purchase price you pay to purchase that business. And we already went over the investment versus when starting versus purchasing the business. Perfect. So now let's move on and let's discuss the other E-2 requirements. So the next E-2 visa requirement is that the E-2 business cannot be marginal. And so what this means is that the business must have either a present or future capacity to hire U.S. workers. So here, the general recommendation is that the E-2 business should have at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operations. And so how do you show, like what employees the business has or plans to have in the future? So in case you are purchasing an already existing business, then you would be submitting things like W-2s of the company, like showing that the company had employees in the past, or current payroll, like showing the current number of the employees. In case you are starting your own business and the business doesn't have any employees yet, in that case, you would be submitting a business plan with the application that would have detailed 5-year hiring projections, basically explaining in detail how many employees you plan to hire in each of the 5 years, on what position, what will be the employees' job duties, and kind of what will be their salary. So in case you are starting a new business, the business plan is going to be a very important part of the E-2 visa application. The next requirement is that the E2 business must be real and operating. So how do you show the E2 business is real and operating? So again, in case you are purchasing an already existing business, you would be submitting things like, for example, bank statements of the company showing incoming payments from client. You would be submitting things like contracts, current contracts you have with the clients. You would be submitting tax returns, W-2s, and payroll showing that the business is already earning revenue and employing workers. In case you are starting a new business in the US, then you would be basically submitting evidence showing that like everything has been set up. Like the company already has a website. The company has a bank account in the US. If you have letters of intent or contracts, you could definitely submit those. So you'd be submitting evidence basically showing that, like everything is set up, all the equipment, everything the business needed to start the operations has been purchased, everything is ready. And really kind of like the last thing missing is for you to get the E-2 visa. And once you come to the US, the business will start earning revenue, immediately. Now, what requirements do you, as the E-2 investor, have to meet to qualify for the E-2 visa? So the E-2 investor has to solely develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. And so what this means is that you will have to show that you will have kind of like an active role in the operations of the E-2 business. So, one thing that would, for example, not be allowed is, for example, if you own a company in the US and, the company is starting and you plan to hire employees, but you personally don't want to have any kind of role in the company. You're already retired and you just want to come retire. So that would not work for an E-2 visa because you do have to show that you will have an active, like executive or managerial role in the company. Another requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company. So this is the rule kind of you have to meet at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, but you always have to keep your ownership at least 50%. So you always have to own at least 50%. And then you must have intent to return to your home country when the E-2 visa expires. And to meet these requirements, the only piece of evidence the consulate usually wants to see is a written signed declaration, basically saying that once your E-2 visa expires, you plan to return to your home country. But if you're, in case you're applying for an E-2 visa, the government, or the consulate, they generally don't want to see like evidence of ties to your home country or anything like that. The only piece of evidence they generally want to see is that signed declaration. Let's see. I think something happened with the PowerPoint. Perfect. So how much investment is enough? So unfortunately, there is no kind of like a minimum investment amount in the regulations, that would say like if you invest this amount, that is sufficient. So that is not the case for the E-2 visa. What the regulations say is that the E-2 investment must be substantial. So how does the government make the determination whether the E-2 investment is substantial? So they do look at kind of like the type of business you are starting. So naturally, if you are, for example, starting a consulting business, the E-2 investment amount will be much lower than if you are, for example, starting like a company where you have to purchase initial inventory and you'll be kind of selling, and the inventory is expensive and you'll be selling it to the clients. So they do look at the type of business. Then the other thing it will depend on is kind of where you apply and the examiner. Some consulates are used to kind of seeing very high investment amounts. And if you kind of apply at one of these consulates with kind of, $70,000 investment, it just may be too low because they are used to seeing much higher investment amounts. So it does kind of depend on the consulate where you are applying it, and also the examiner, the consular officer. And then it will also depend on the overall strength of your application. So, sometimes there are cases where the investment amount is on the lower side. So let's say that, for example, you spend around $45,000, you have some additional money on the company's account as working capital, but the company has already hired 2 workers. You are able to show several contracts with clients, and the company is already earning revenue in the US. So in this case, even if the investment amount is kind of on the lower side, the other aspects of the application, the fact that the company already has employees, the company's already earning revenue, you are able to show contracts with clients, those are all very beneficial things for the E2 visa application. So in that case, sometimes there are cases where the investment amount is low, but those cases may still be approved because the investor is able to strengthen the other parts of the application. The kind of how the consulate or how the government makes a determination whether the amount is substantial, they do what is called a proportionality test. So they basically kind of like look at the amount you invested in the business, and then they look at the amount, like what is the average kind of investment amount to be, to set up this type of business, and they kind of compare the amounts, and if they are similar, then the conclusion would be that the investment was proportional. In case you are buying a business in the US, the government would generally just kind of look at the purchase price of the business in the purchase sale agreement, and then the fair market value of the business. And then, if those are same or kind of very similar, then, that would be sufficient to meet the requirement. So as we discussed, franchises are definitely a good option for E2 visas. So what are some common good versus bad E2 visa expenditures? So, some good or typical E2 visa expenditures we would include as part of the investment if you're starting your own business would be, for example, money you paid for the business entity, as a business entity setup, any money you paid for like marketing, website setup, legal fees, if you will be selling products, any money you paid for inventory, any money you paid to rent office or warehouse space. If you already have employees, you could include any money you already paid the employees or contractors, any money you spend to purchase, for example, computer equipment or furniture or anything you need. So those would be some typical E2 visa expenditures. Some bad or better said, like weak E2 visa expenditures would be, for example, things we wouldn't include would be, for example, let's say that you are in your home country and then you fly to the US to kind of set up the E2 business, to set up bank account, and you want to include the flight, you purchase to get to the US, the Airbnb, if you rent a car. So those would all be kind of weak E2 visa expenditures. We wouldn't include as part of the investment. Perfect. So now let's move on and let's discuss if you have to hire US employees. So this is so-called marginality requirement. And as I said, the E2 company must have either present or future capacity to kind of generate enough income to provide for more than a minimal living for you and your family. And how the marginality requirement is met is by demonstrating that the E2 business already has employees or will be able to hire employees in the next 5 years. So our general recommendation is that the E2 company has at least 3 full-time employees by year 5 of operation. So in case you are starting a new business, you would be submitting a business plan with the application, and you would basically describe in the business plan, like how many employees on what positions, whether it'll be full-time or part-time, you plan to hire in the next 5 years. W2 employees are better for E2, but in case your business is in an industry where it's kind of standard to hire 1099 contractors, like for example, if you are starting a construction company and many of the workers will be working for US contractors, that is fine. We would at the renewal stage, we will submit evidence of the 1099s you issue to the contractors. But even in that case, you would still want to have at least some W2 employees, like, for example, like a secretary or office manager or a manager who will be managing those contractors, or at least some W2 employees. Perfect. And so how do you prove that the business has or will have employees? So as we said, if it's a new business, then you will be submitting a strong business plan with the application. And in the business plan, you would be describing the hiring projections for the next 5 years. And if the business is already existing, like for example, if you purchase an already existing business, you would be submitting things like W-2s for the past 3 years, showing that the business had multiple employees. You would be submitting payroll or pay stubs for the current calendar year. And then you would also be submitting tax returns, that would show the salaries that were paid to the employees in the past couple of years. Perfect. And I will turn it over to Kelly, who will go over some business plan considerations.
Thank you, Michaela. So a common question we receive for E2s is, do I need a business plan? And this can depend on whether you're starting a new business or purchasing an existing business. So if you're starting a brand new business, then yes, you absolutely need a business plan for an E2 visa application. You'll see on the consulate websites, they often will outline this. In fact, some of them even require that you get a CPA to certify the financials of the business plan. So in that case, you may need to hire a professional and have a CPA who's able to sign off on that. If you're purchasing an existing business and it's been going very well for many years and you have strong tax returns that show consistent or growing revenue and profits and many employees, then it may not be necessary to have a business plan. However, if you are purchasing a business and maybe it's a purchase from a family member, or maybe the business is struggling, maybe it hasn't been doing very well, or it's only had a couple of employees over the years. In that situation, a business plan can be helpful to show how you're going to expand the business, turn things around, hire more people, and make it a non-marginal enterprise. In terms of whether you need to hire a professional, this really varies. There are some, applicants who feel very comfortable in this area, very comfortable with financials, able to, handle the process of drafting a business plan. However, we will say that it can be beneficial to have somebody draft a plan who's familiar with the immigration requirements, because, for example, the type of information you might have in an investor pitch deck is going to be somewhat different than what you would focus on for an E2 application. So there can be a benefit to hiring a professional, although there's also, of course, if the applicant feels competent to do so, they can draft the business plan themselves. So what should the business plan contain? And so for an E2 visa, as I mentioned, there's kind of very specific things you want to focus on. One is an executive summary. Who are you? What do you do? Who do you sell to? Another is market research and analysis. So proving that there is actually a market for the services that you're offering is very important. Also a marketing plan. So how are you going to sell your services or your products to people? They do want to see a realistic plan here. Often they want to see a website. If it's not active yet, you can indicate that, but maybe they want to see, screenshots of, the website that will go live once the visa is granted. A personnel plan is very important. As Michaela mentioned, you need this to prove that the business will not be marginal. And you can include 5 years of hiring projections, showing, who will be hired. You also want to have a comprehensive financial plan. So this would be 5 years, including a profit and loss, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement. And this can demonstrate that the business has the ability to, generate, a substantial income and hire workers, over the long term. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about some E2 developments and adjudication trends. These are some things that we have seen and I think we'll see more of, especially during the change in administration. So one is more focus on whether you purchased, your investment materials in the United States. There is nothing that requires you to make your investment in the United States. That being said, the E2 investor visa is meant to facilitate kind of trade and economic benefit, between, the treaty country and the United States. And, one thing we do see, saw in the last time administration and expect we will start to see again soon is really a focus on, both hiring in the US, hiring US employees, and also making sure that, more of your investment is spent in the United States. Anecdotally, we have heard of officers asking, what percentage of your expenditures were made in the US. So it is always beneficial to take that into account. If you're importing inventory or you have, specific purchases you have to make abroad, you certainly can do that. But you also want to think about, strategically trying to make several expenditures in the United States. Administrative processing is also something that we will probably, start to see more of, particularly because of the new executive orders that sometimes, ask for kind of maximum vetting when it comes to visa applications. So administrative processing can kind of falls into two boxes. One is where the consulate is just asking for some more information. Maybe they want to see a resume or, information about your visa history or, proof. Of your operating agreement, something that they were missing from the E-2 file. Those can be resolved rather quickly, usually within a few weeks, because that is basically the consulate asking for more information. And once you provide it, they will issue a final decision. Administrative processing can also mean that another agency outside the consulate has flagged the application for additional screening. They don't provide a lot of information about this because of national security reasons, but in this case, it can be much longer before the administrative processing is resolved. The reason being that the consulate does not have any control over, when administrative processing will resolve for that type of case. Ultimately, they are also waiting to hear from whichever agency flagged the application to see if they can, um, allow the case to proceed or issue a final, decision on the case. So, in those instances, you would want to continue following up, maybe every 30 days to make sure they're checking in about it. But unfortunately, it can drag out for quite some time, even up to and over a year. Uh, Another thing we're seeing is kind of more USCIS filings. This started during the pandemic when obviously it was much harder for people to travel and, consulates were not processing visa applications in the same way. Doing USCIS filings, there are kind of pros and cons to this. Benefit is you don't have to leave the United States. Some cons are, there will be, an enhanced focus on kind of your maintenance of status in the US. Additionally, for an E-2, you're not going to get a visa stamp. So once you travel internationally, you'll still have to go to a consulate to get a visa stamp and submit a brand new E-2 application. You'll also have to provide, more proof on the source and trail of funds if you're doing a USCIS filing. Um, Something that people are always asking about is timing at various consulates. So it is important to ask about this when you're deciding where to apply. Timing does vary widely. There are many consulates that are, fully back to, the processing times they had pre-pandemic. London, Toronto, Japan are some that come to mind. There are some posts that are still struggling a bit with visa backlog, and maybe they started up their E-2 programs again very late. Bogota comes to mind. And so in those cases, maybe several months, even up to and over a year waiting for an appointment. So it is something that you want to check on because there are some places where you'll be waiting a couple weeks, somewhere it's a couple months, and somewhere it's even longer than that. All right, let's talk about some issues and complex areas, for E2s. So one is the source and trail of funds, and this is particularly the case for USCIS filings. So if you're doing a change of status or an extension of status with USCIS and they want to see the source and trail of funds, they really are looking for a dollar for dollar accounting of exactly where the money was, up until you spent it on the E2 expenditures. So whereas at a consulate, they may take a very high level view. Perhaps at a consulate, if you say this is personal savings from employment, they might be satisfied with proof of, 3 years of tax returns and proof of a lump sum transfer, to another to the E2 company bank account from your bank account. With USCIS, what they would want to see is the tax returns and then also your pay stubs, your payroll entering your bank account being maintained there. If you transferred it anywhere, if you kept it in a savings account or, invested it or did something else with it, they would want to follow that exact trail up until you spent the money. So if you do have multiple sources of funds or you think it would be very hard to get bank statements or proof of where the money came from, a USCIS filing may not be the right choice for you. Something else we see a lot are, people asking about, seller financing for, business purchases, and loans secured by assets of an E2 company cannot be used as part of the investment. So if you are buying a business and let's say you want to put down, 50% of the purchase price and do seller financing for the other 50%, this is not a good arrangement for the E2 because the seller financing, is going to be, secured by the assets of the E2 company. And that means that they'll consider these funds are not at risk and likely your investment is not going to be considered substantial. So you can take out loans for your E2 investment, but they have to be personal loans that are either secured by your personal property, for example, a second mortgage on your home, a refinance or an unsecured line of credit, something like that in your personal name, not in the company's name. And these can be used for E2 investment. You can also use a gift for E2 investment. You would include a gift letter. It is important to make sure that the gift giver will be comfortable providing the sensitive financial documentation to show where they got the money from. So if you're getting a gift, it's not going to be sufficient to just get a gift from a family member and say, this is, here's the gift letter. You'll also need to provide the proof of where the gift giver got that money, whether that's their tax returns, sale of a property, things like that. Small investment amounts, and we do have a webinar that specifically addresses, small investment amounts and kind of strategies that you can use to strengthen these types of cases. But this can be, something that's complex to navigate. Certain consulates are much less open to small investment amounts, and some are much friendlier. For example, London and Toronto are two posts that are kind of very friendly to, small businesses or, solo entrepreneurs. If you do have a very small investment amount, you really want to add some additional evidence to make it clear that this really is everything that needed to be spent to get the business up and running. It's also going to be very important that you are able to, like maybe include some market research, something from a professional organization that shows that you've spent, what's needed for the case. And then you also want to have each other element of the case be as strong as possible. So a really strong business plan, maybe if you can get contracts or letters from clients, that can be very helpful. E2 visas for two investors. This can work if you have a 50-50 ownership arrangement. If it's not 50-50, if maybe someone owns 70, someone owns 30, you won't both be able to be E2 investors. But if you do own it 50-50, this is possible. And if you have the same nationality and you have something like a 70-30 ownership, you could consider doing one E2 investor application and one E2 employee application. Substantive changes to the business after filing. So this is a very important one. There are some people who believe they get their E2 visa for a certain company and now they have this work visa and they can kind of freely work in the US, but this is not the case. You're permitted to work for the business that you presented to the consulate. So if you said, I'm opening a French restaurant and now you want to close down that French restaurant and open up a, business consulting company, you cannot do that without first going back to the consulate or going back to USCIS and getting an approval. If it's not a substantive change, so if it's maybe it's a marketing consultancy and we're still doing that, but we, are going to service primarily, finance world instead of previously we were focused on the art world, that's fine. That type of change is not going to be considered substantive. You don't need to get, a new approval for that. But if you are considering major changes to your business, either in the ownership structure or in the type of services you're offering, you want to discuss with an attorney first before you make those changes because, shutting down the business and starting a new line of business without an approval is going to be considered a violation of status. Family business purchases. So this comes up a lot. If you're going to do a family business purchase, you just know that there's going to be a lot of enhanced scrutiny on your application. You want to make sure that you're doing everything possible to demonstrate that the business purchase is legitimate. Perhaps getting an evaluation of the business from an outside, objective third party, or having a CPA weigh in on the financials and opining whether the amount that you're paying for the business is the fair market value based on the financials. So you want to keep that in mind, just that there's going to be more scrutiny on your application and you want more evidence to prove that you have paid the fair market value. Common reasons for E-2 denials. So one is low investment amount. There are some investment amounts that are just too low. We had a client come to us, they had applied on their own and spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. That amount is going to be it's just too low. Even if arguably you say, well, I have my computer, I'm a consultant, I don't need to spend any more money. Ultimately, to demonstrate, that you meet the E-2 requirements and that you've invested an amount that is of a magnitude that guarantees you'll run the business, you're going to need to invest more than just, $2,000. This person ended up, making additional expenditures up to $50,000, reapplied, and was ultimately approved. The nature of the business can also, impact E-2 denials. There are certain areas that are kind of, under higher scrutiny. So real estate is one of these. Consulates are very sensitive to the idea of somebody purchasing a property and just putting it in an LLC and just passively collecting rental income. Consulting companies often receive a lot of scrutiny because there's a concern someone's going to come in and operate as a solo consultant and not actually build out a business that's going to, hire workers. Um, Anyone who's doing kind of equity trading, that can also be an area of scrutiny. You need to have a lot of licenses for that, and they want to make sure that somebody is actually going to be doing enough activity, to support workers in the United States. So filing location, venue, this can be a common reason for denial. As I mentioned previously, there are some consulates that are just less friendly to certain types of applications. Some consulates are very used to seeing very large multinational companies, maybe that are making millions of dollars in investments and sending over tons of employees. They may not be as receptive to an entrepreneur who's opened up an LLC and spent $60,000. So you do want to take that into account, when you're figuring out where you can apply, because there are various trends at different consulates that change over time. Um, concern over whether a business will create jobs for U.S. workers. Marginality is a very important part of the E-2 application. You want to have a strong business plan. Sometimes maybe if someone's been running a similar business in their home country for many years and they never hired anyone, this can create concern for the officer. In those types of cases, we do encourage people to try to hire before they apply, just to, address that concern before the officer really focuses on it. You can also have issues with your adjudicating officer. So, consular officers are human beings. Sometimes they are having a bad day. Sometimes they're new in their training, or, don't understand the regulations as well, or maybe they see one type of case and your case is different than that. Very, very rarely we've had people report, having an officer who was just completely wrong about something, or very rude or disrespectful. In those cases, ultimately the officer does have uh, discretion, over whether or not they're going to grant or deny the visa. So we always encourage people to be as polite as possible. Try to politely ask, what issues they had with the case, so they can, think about reapplying. And if you did feel like you got a really unfair officer or that they were really wrong, there are things you can do, including reapplying, and most consulates will try to give you a different officer the next time around. Another reason may be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So, sometimes people may file on their own, or perhaps with an attorney that's not as well versed in the requirements. For example, if you, applied, but the entire, you purchased a business and, everything was seller financing, you didn't put any money down, those types of things, you just don't qualify. Ultimately, you would want to revisit the application, and there is an ability to reapply if the circumstances have changed. All right, let's talk about renewals. So to renew an E-2 visa, hiring U.S. workers is very important. They really want to see that. A lot of consulates only ask to see tax returns and W-2s. Every now and then, if somebody says, well, I only hire 1099s, but it's very common in my industry, for example, in construction, and maybe they're paying millions of dollars to subcontractors through 1099s. Those types of circumstances, you may still be able to argue, that the business isn't marginal, even if they haven't hired any direct employees. That being said, it's always stronger for a renewal case to hire U.S. workers. We usually recommend trying to have at least 3 to 5 full-time employees by the time you go for your renewal, although this may depend on how long the business has been running, and when you're reapplying for your renewal. They'll want to see updated financial data, so tax returns for at least 2 years. Some consulates ask for tax returns for example, in London, they may ask for tax returns for, all the years since you last got your E-2, so it might be 5 years. They're going to see, is the company profitable? What do the revenues look like? If there's kind of major changes or dips to the revenue, does the company have a plan, to get back on track? They'll also want to see kind of payroll information, so not just W-2s, but what is the current payroll summary? Are there currently employees working for the company? If the company is really not doing well, this happened a lot kind of during COVID, or, companies that were reapplying around that time, 2020, 2021. Sometimes you can submit kind of a supplementary business plan showing how the business plans to, hire workers, or what its plans are to kind of, strategize and get back to a place, where it can hire employees and be, on a good path financially. They'll also check to see if the company still meets the E-2 requirements. So any changes to ownership would be significant, and also changes to the type of business are things they would look at. So if the ownership of the company has dropped below 50% for a treaty country national, that's going to be, problematic. Similarly, if, you applied with, as a wedding photographer, and now you've opened a car manufacturing plant, that's going to be a major, major problem. So, they will like look to see, what has the growth of the business been, and is the business still doing kind of what it said it was going to do? Although rarely will they look back and compare against old business plans. Usually they're much more interested in just what's happened, at that time. Right. So questions. I think only one has come in. Says, although the original business plan projected hiring employees in the first year, the business was in early stages, focused on establishing operations. No employees were hired in the first year. Business has now stabilized and is showing improvement. We began hiring in the second year. So this kind of goes to what I was just talking about. Ultimately, it's okay if you're not able to follow your business plan exactly. What they will consider when you go back for the renewal stage is, where are you at that time? What do the tax returns look like? Were you able to hire? You're not going to be held to, exactly the projections of the business plan. All right. Looks like that was the only question we had that came in. Uh, so we will close. I'd see one more. What is the renewal period? 3 years. Michaela, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this goes back to the first slide. So this is going to depend on your country of nationality, and on the reciprocity period. So, for example, if you are a national of Canada, you can get the visa for 5 years, and then you would have to renew it every 5 years. But you can find the reciprocity schedule on the Department of State website for your particular country, and then you would basically renew it before the end of the visa period.
Perfect. Someone says they have a question. Feel free to just write it in. We'll be taking questions the next, 4 minutes. What are the approximate costs? So please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to send you our engagement letter on costs. How many minimum employees on renewal are required for it not to be marginal? Michaela, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I would say that the minimum would be the three full-time employees. You can have part-time equivalents, so that would be like 6 part-time employees. As I said, like there are some businesses where it's custom to hire independent contractors. So in some instances, we may be able to point to those contractors, but the general recommendations would be 3 full-time employees by year 5.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I will say though, like there's no requirement that you have a certain number of employees in the law anywhere. We have been able to make arguments and get approvals with less than 3, but it does weaken the case. And there's certainly consulates where even 3, they may not consider sufficient. So, there's not a minimum. It's going to be kind of case specific to your business. Someone's asking about return to home country. What if I'm applying from inside the US as adjustment of status? If you're applying for a change of status from within the United States, an adjustment of status is a green card process, but I'm assuming you mean change of status for an E-2. You still do have to, have the intent to depart the United States. So that is still a requirement, even if you're doing a change of status. Someone says, I have a sport product with 3 patents for 20 years. The investment, it's only 50,000. If you have specific questions about your particular case, I would strongly recommend setting up a consultation with us and we can talk through kind of the issues, and any possibilities for your case. Michaela, can you take the next question?
Yeah. So a couple starts a business, each owns 50%. One works in the business, the other doesn't. Can the other get open work permit? Sometimes like when there are two E-2 investors, like each investor can separately get an E-2 investor visa. But basically, if you get an E-2 investor visa, you are only allowed to work for that particular E2 business. Like if the other partner, owns 50% but doesn't want to work for the E2 business, then the other partner cannot get E2 investor visa and would have to kind of look at other visa options. So I hope I answered the question.
Right. What is the difference between applying from Pakistan and Canada, and what is a recommended amount of investment? So Pakistan and Canada, I mean, each have different, kind of submission requirements. I would say Canada generally, our experience is that they are a more friendly E2 consulate than Pakistan and are friendlier to kind of smaller investment amounts. I would suggest kind of rewatching the webinar, which we made available to kind of go over recommended investment amounts. There's not a specific number. It's going to depend on the type of business you're starting. Um, I don't need more money to invest for the start of the business. I'm from Mexico. I have a TN visa. I'm not sure, what this is asking, but um, if you have specific questions about your case, feel free to set up a consultation with us. Michaela, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah. What is the current wait time at the Toronto consulate? So right now we have been seeing, so after you submit the E2 visa application, the consulate has to do an initial review of the application. And once the review is done, they will send you an email and then you'll be able to schedule an appointment. So right now we are seeing that the initial review takes about, I would say, 4 to 5 weeks. And then once you get the email, you should be able to get an appointment within, I would say, like 2, 3, or 4 weeks. So within like a month.
Perfect. All right. Someone said if you travel on the I-94, the visa's expired, can you leave the country and re-enter on I-94? There is something called automatic visa revalidation, which can potentially be used, but it is very specific. You can't kind of travel anywhere. It's like certain trips. So I'd say if you have questions about that, set up a consultation because it's, it is tricky. You don't want to leave and think you can re-enter and then potentially you cannot. What are green card chances after the E2? So, there's kind of no direct path from any temporary visa to a green card. It's just if you're in the US on an E2 and you have, there's a green card category available to you, you qualify for one, you can apply for one. So kind of there's, our clients on E2 sometimes will go through the EB2 national interest waiver process, sometimes through the EB5 process, sometimes they go through the PERM process if there's another company that wants to sponsor them for a green card. So there are various options, and we do have webinars kind of on various employment-based green card options. I would encourage you to check those out if you have questions about that. Yes, this is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. So I think those are all the questions. So we'll close here. Thank you so much, Michaela, for sharing your expertise. I hope everyone has a wonderful Friday.
Thank you.